Horseshoe theory states that both the far left and the far right are not that different because they both converge on being evil dictatorships. The equation here is quite simple. It's Nazis equals communists, and by process of elimination, if the extremes are vicious and evil, then the center must stand for everything good and true, such as freedom, democracy, individualism, and grilling on Sundays. However, it is a fact that this theory does not hold much intellectual weight. It has been extensively rejected and ridiculed by most political scientists, while the people who do support it tend not to be the smartest political analysts. The result is a political theory for children and average voters, and yet I think that there is something to it. In the political stage, both the left and the right sell ideas to the people, and the fact is that some of these ideas sell better than others. In the first part of this essay, we will list the products that each side sells. Then, I will argue that through the logic of marketing, they both converge on the same optimal political formula to seduce the masses. Finally, I will argue that this proves horseshoe theory right, and that the result of an active democracy is more or less fascism. More on that later. And before I start the arguments, I just want to state that I will be using my own definitions in this essay. And I don't want anyone saying, hello, poli-sci major here. Actually, I don't care. Political science is as scientific as astrology. You can literally make up your own definitions, and people are free to disagree with them. Democracy, giving power to the people, or giving the kratos to the demos, has many meanings because it has been used and abused by dozens of ideologies. For the purposes of this essay, democracy is the active engagement of the majority of a population in the political affairs of their state, as opposed to their systematic alienation from politics. But I want to focus a little bit more on the word democracy. What makes something democratic? To know what democratic means, we must first know what its opposite is. The opposite of a democracy is a system where the average person is completely alienated from politics. A system somewhat like feudalism, where politics were the exclusive concern of the nobles. This was possible because most of the population was illiterate, because most identities and languages were local, and most importantly because wars were fought by relatively small professional armies. But this alienation of the masses ends in modern times, principally because of technological advancement. The invention of the printing press makes universal literacy possible, which crystallizes culture and language, and of course, industrial warfare, which requires mass mobilization. After all, one must convince millions of people to leave their homes, to risk death on a far-off land, and this can only be done by politicizing them. These three factors led to the politicization of the masses in the 19th century. The average person indeed developed an active partisan interest in politics. Thus, all modern governments must actively persuade their subjects that they are legitimate. Because if the people stop believing the propaganda and lose their faith in the government simply collapses. A modern state, unlike a feudal one, needs the cooperation of millions of people to run properly, and when this does not happen, the gears stop turning. In fact, we have seen many such collapses in the last century: the February and October revolutions in Russia, the fall of East Germany, and the overthrow of Milosevic, etc. This means that even in undemocratic regimes, democracy is still present, because each one of these regimes has to win over the people or face collapse. A revolution is nothing more than an armed election. Today, no modern government can exist without popular support, and this makes them democratic in my estimation. For example, is the Taliban democratic? Yes. They are the legitimate government in the eyes of the deeply religious people of Afghanistan. In fact, they represent the wishes of the people far more than the US-backed Republic of Afghanistan ever did, which could hardly convince its own soldiers not to defect to the Taliban en masse. But if tomorrow the Taliban government decided to become Mormons, they would lose their mandate and would be quickly overthrown by a new Islamic movement which would represent the will of the Afghan people. This is the reason that the 20th century was the century of propaganda. Every single regime had to sell the idea that they were legitimate to their masses. Politicians are fundamentally salesmen. They offer ideas, personalities, and promises, while the electorate are the buyers, and they choose the ones that they most like. This is no different in a system with free elections or in a dictatorship. The difference is that elections offer a bloodless way to remove an unpopular government, while most dictatorships collapse in revolution and civil war, which is normally not very good for the health of the leader. Therefore, politics is much more of an exercise in marketing than anything else. The great insight that began modern marketing is that the public psychology is predictable, that they have simple desires and needs. What makes a successful politician is that he can appeal to the desires of the people and keep them happy. One example that applies across the political spectrum is the popular desire to have a charismatic leader. This might be a tangent, but is it not strange that in our day and age we still need to put a single person at the head of a country when this person has only marginal control over the state apparatus? The reason why we have one person representing the face of the nation, even when this person has limited power, is that people like it. In an election, a party that nominates a committee will always be defeated by one that nominates a charismatic politician that will give a smiling face and a cheerful personality to the committee behind him. However, the left and the right tend to appeal to very different public desires. What then are the main products that both the left and the right are selling to the people? In the case of the right wing, their flagship product is nationalism, aka patriotism, identity politics, or wokeism if you're James Lindsay. Nationalism sells incredibly well because it appeals to one of the most fundamental human needs out there, the need to belong to a community, of having an identity, a home, a place in the sun. Nationalism is also the most powerful idea when it comes to mass mobilization. One would be hard-pressed to name a war where nationalist rhetoric was not used to unite the country against an enemy. In fact, during World War I, the bitter class struggle between workers and the bourgeoisie was halted in the name of the national cause. In France, it even had a cool name, l'Union Sacrée. Nationalism is an extremely reliable product because it leads to people voting as a bloc on the basis of their identity, which hardly ever changes. The Indians call this a vote bank. It is a constituency that will always vote a certain way because supporting a certain political party or a candidate is a part of their identity. Therefore, with almost no exceptions, in fact, the few exceptions to the rule are often considered traitors to their own identity. African Americans vote for the Democrats, Hindi speakers vote for Modi, white Brazilians voted for Bolsonaro, brown ones for Lula da Silva, and in most African and Middle Eastern countries, the local dictatorship represents, first and foremost, the ethnic interest of his tribe. Nationalism, generally speaking, is a right-wing product when it represents the ethnic majority. But minority nationalism can also be found in left-wing coalitions, like in the US, where most ethnic minorities vote blue because the GOP is seen as a white man's party, which it partly is, given that most whites have voted Republican in every election since 1964. The right wing has, in my estimation, two other secondary products in its arsenal. The first is religion, and the second one is capitalism. I think it is clear why religion is a powerful force in electoral politics on the side of the right wing. It has great moral influence, and it works as the bastion of tradition. Generally, religion is a conservative force which agitates against left-wing movements, which tend to be anti-clerical. Often religion and nationalism are deeply interlinked, like for example in Yugoslavia, where the religious differences in time became the national ones. The Croats are Catholic, the Bosnians are Muslim, and the Serbians are Orthodox. And although it might seem that there are some Orthodox Bosnians, those are Serbians living in Bosnia. However, I would argue that nationalism is a much more powerful unifying force than religion is, because even in nominally religious societies, only a fraction of the population actually takes the religion seriously. Furthermore, religious unity is much weaker than national unity. The French and the Ottomans had a 300-year-long alliance against the Austrians, who were just as Catholic as the French were. Not to mention that the bond between Catholic Poland and Catholic Congo is barely there because religion tends to assimilate itself to the local culture more than the other way around. The final right-wing product is capitalism, neoliberalism, deregulation, or whatever you want to call it. It offers more freedom to the market, which generally helps the economy grow, even if this growth primarily benefits the bourgeoisie and the upper middle class. Capitalism is an attractive formula in the countries with large middle classes and strong economic growth. Its limitation is that it cannot easily appeal to the working class or to the middle class if the economy is not doing too well. But again, there are many historical examples of nationalism trumping capitalism. For example, it was clear that World War I would be economically ruinous for both winners and losers. This was clear within the first year of the war, but this did not stop the Italians, Romanians, Ottomans, and Americans from joining in, often with severe consequences, because national feeling was much stronger than their objective economic interests. On the other side of the aisle, we have the political products that the left sells. Their main product is, without a doubt, socialism. Here, I'm using the label in its broadest sense, which includes any material benefits that the government can offer to the people. For the purposes of this essay, socialism is the ideology that advocates restructuring the economy to improve the material conditions of the many. This can include both a revolution and an extensive welfare state which is paid for by the rich. Socialism is an immensely popular product to sell to the masses because it appeals directly to their material needs. It promises to improve their living conditions, their salary, to provide free education to everyone, and to take care of them if they lose either their jobs or their health. Essentially, it promises that the state will become their patron, which will provide security and material benefits in exchange for their vote. Of course, there is also an important class element to this, where the proletariat generally favors socialist tendencies, while the bourgeoisie and the middle class oppose them. However, as long as there is inequality in society, where the few have more than the many, socialism will be a popular platform, which means that it will always be a popular platform given that all societies that we have observed throughout history have an unequal distribution of wealth. The secondary products that the left sells are internationalism and liberation. Internationalism refers to the explicit rejection of nationalism and ethnic exclusion in favor of establishing a world where everyone can live in peace, cooperation, and achieve a vibrant multiculturalism. There are strong historical reasons for this belief. The World War showed the dangers of nationalism. No country in Europe was untouched by the devastation, famine, and ethnic cleansing. Many liberals and leftists concluded that the way to peace was to avoid nationalism altogether, never to discriminate based on ethnicity, religion, or the place where you were born. This thinking still leads much of the modern left. However, internationalism is popular because it appeals to cosmopolitans, to the people who travel the world, who speak many languages, and enjoy the other cultures. Although most cosmopolitans have not gone to rural Somalia, preferring Cancun or maybe Paris. This will not resonate with the peasants, who have never interacted with anybody outside their town, let alone somebody from another culture. But internationalism will resonate especially well with the urban intellectual class, who express xenophilia as a class marker that differentiates them from the proles. As a result, the ideas of internationalism will be greatly overrepresented in academia and underrepresented on the street. The secondary product of the left is liberation. In this context, I mean liberation as the complete opposite of restrictive traditional morality. This is also popular because traditional norms are vastly unpopular today. If a traditionalist party came to power in a Western nation and decided to make sex outside marriage illegal, how popular would this really be with 18-year-olds? But beyond sexual morality, the side of liberation also holds a very strong position with artists, homosexuals, New Age types, gamers, stoners, and of course, women. These groups broadly support the left out of fear that tradition would prohibit their lifestyles, given that they do not comply with the prejudices of the 1950s. The left can sell liberation because there is a considerable percentage of the population who just wants to be left alone and not have the state or their dad telling them what to do. Liberation also has a very interesting overlap with capitalism, because although one is with the left and the other one is with the right, they do have a symbiotic relationship. Liberation tears down traditional morality, and the market takes its place. In exchange, the market promotes liberation as a cool lifestyle. Let's not forget that during the 60s, the fashion and the music were there to sell. Generally speaking, in every democracy, especially in its early stages, one can see a general arms race between the left and the right, where both try to aggressively sell their ideas to the public to achieve power. The left agitates for socialism, internationalism, and liberation, while the right has pushed for nationalism, religion, and capitalism. The result of this arms race is a political stalemate. Both the left and the right can win power, but none can keep it indefinitely and use it to fulfill their ideological aims. The conservative right cannot consolidate power because it does not address the plight of the poor. And the left cannot hold on to power because of their rejection of popular nationalist sentiment. And of course, the centrists between the two also have a hard time pleasing the electorate because they seek a lukewarm compromise that does not please anyone. We can observe this type of democratic stalemate in many of the early democracies, such as France and Germany, in the early 20th century. On one side, there were large workers' movements, and on the other, a strong nationalist sentiment. This led to dozens of deadlocked governments that were not dominated by either side. The socialist SPD was already the most popular party in Germany by 1890, even though they were not allowed into the government. Meanwhile, the conservatives held their power through the Kaiser, but their low popularity forced them to make coalitions with the liberals. This situation led to a deadlock where none of the parties had primacy. Even when the SPD came into power during the Weimar Republic, they were still unable to wield hegemonic power because the army and the patriotic Freikorps were still hostile to them, and because the revolutionary wing of the party split off from them to form the communist KPD. Thus, the SPD was crushed between the communists and the nationalists. In France, the situation was even more volatile. On the left, you have the socialist SFIO, and on the right, you have a disorganized but energetic nationalist movement exemplified by Général Boulanger and his revanchist platform, which did have mass appeal given that it won 58% of the vote in working-class Paris. In between the two, one had the Radical Party, which was both nationalist and reform-oriented, but in time it was also squeezed between the left and the right as they became more polarized, with socialism on one side and nationalism on the other. Throughout the Third French Republic, no party held a majority, and the governments were notoriously unstable coalitions. The final example of deadlock between the left and the right that I would like to mention was the dynamic between the aristocratic optimates and the proletarian populares in the late Roman Republic. Here you also have a situation where, despite the brutal purges, both parties did not disappear because their support bases were still there. But what ended up happening to the Roman Republic? Everybody knows that power was consolidated by Augustus. But how did he manage it? By becoming a hybrid of both parties. He pushed the land reform and the free grain of the populares, which, as the name implies, was really popular with the people of Rome, and on the other hand, he also embodied the aristocratic and republican traditions of the optimates, and posed as the restorer of traditional order. Although there are similarities, Roman politics are not modern politics. That being said, I will argue that today, just like 2,000 years ago, the way to complete political hegemony has always been a hybridization between the left and the right. This results in a regime that is able to sell both socialism and nationalism at the same time, thus combining the two most powerful products of the left and the right. This means that if a socialist regime wants to become hegemonic, it must de facto embrace nationalism, even if they believe de jure in internationalism. Is this not what we have seen in the 20th century? I will assert that every single socialist or communist regime has embraced nationalism in one form or another. Patriotic socialism creates a new national identity that joins the culture and the history of the country with socialist and revolutionary principles. The result is that being a revolutionary becomes a key part of the national identity itself. Very much like being a revolutionary is a key part of the modern French identity, today Russian nationalists use the hammer and the sickle as their symbol. However, the Soviet Union was always connected with a sense of Russian nationalism. This is certainly a controversial statement because, ideologically, the USSR was always committed to internationalism and socialist brotherhood. The nationalist undertones were normally left unsaid. However, they were there since the beginning. Lenin was heavily influenced by earlier strands of Russian socialism, especially Narodnism. The Narodniks were a late 19th century movement which saw itself as a uniquely Russian socialism based around the peasantry, the land, and the Russian soul. They were responsible for many assassinations, most famously that of Tsar Alexander II. They saw the nobility and the bourgeoisie as foreign parasitic elements disconnected from the will of the Russian peasantry, and thus throwing them off was a cause of national liberation. During the Russian Revolution itself, Red Army propaganda used nationalist appeals to mobilize the Russian people against the White Armies and the foreign expeditions which they saw as foreign invaders attacking the motherland. In the pamphlet Defend the Socialist Fatherland, Lenin writes, quote, "It is the sacred duty of the workers and peasants of Russia to devotedly defend the Republic of Soviets against the hordes of bourgeois imperialist Germany. The socialist fatherland is in danger. Long live the socialist fatherland. Long live the international socialist revolution." End quote. The triumphant Red Army also put down different independence movements to re-establish the former borders of the Russian Empire. Independence was crushed in Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Chechnya, while the Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, and Finland were later invaded, with the intention of annexation during World War II. A large percentage of the locals in these new SSRs were deported and Russians brought in, especially in the Baltics. This Russian-centric policy truly crystallized with the end of the NEP in the 30s, and with the emergence of socialism in one country, as opposed to the internationalist approach of Trotsky. During the Great Purge, non-Russian Bolsheviks were often accused of treason based on their ethnic origins. Poles like Rokossovsky, Finns like Manner, Lithuanians like Alksins, and Jews like Lozovsky, while Russian ones were almost always convicted and executed on charges of treason against the motherland on behalf of foreign powers. The Russian language was imposed on the peripheral regions of the USSR in the name of modernization, and in the Soviet sphere, Russia saw itself as a leader of the socialist world, with other countries being junior partners to be directed. This did not sit well with the Chinese. Indeed, this tension led to the Sino-Soviet split and to border skirmishes between the two in 1969 over an uninhabited island that left hundreds dead. Nationalism has also flourished in the People's Republic of China. The CCP is overwhelmingly a Han-dominated institution that imposes Chinese culture and language on the periphery, especially in Xinjiang and Tibet. Hardly an example of socialist internationalism. Cambodia took this to its most extreme when Pol Pot tried to purify the country from its Vietnamese minority, but pretty much every single socialist regime has developed its own version of revolutionary nationalism. The examples are many. Cuba, Mexico under the PRI, Venezuela, Yugoslavia, Albania, East Germany, and Romania all developed their own version of patriotic nationalism. And I believe that there is a very good reason for this, namely, that nationalism is a product that sells much better than internationalism with the average person. Therefore, replacing internationalism with revolutionary nationalism is the smart move to consolidate power, and that, in my humble opinion, is why there is not a single case of an actually internationalist socialist regime, much to the disappointment of the Trotskyists. The winning formula for the left is socialism, nationalism, and liberation. On the right wing, this strategy is somewhat similar. They embrace socialism but put it under the service of the nation. The result is a much more powerful political formula because it embraces the democratic roots of nationalism. The basic idea of nationalism is that the people of a nation have a common destiny and a common will that is represented by the state. However, notice the idea of the people being central to nationalism. It is fundamentally a democratic idea because it does not differentiate between the peasant and the aristocrat. Indeed, the aristocracies of the 19th century opposed nationalism in 1848 and only embraced it later for pragmatic reasons. The life of Bismarck shows this tension very clearly. This leveling tendency of nationalism, where every member of the nation is seen as an equal, appeals to the masses because it includes them, regardless of their social standing or their economic situation. It offers a common identity, and with this common identity, it logically follows that there must exist a common sympathy, and thus there is an internal tension between capitalism and nationalism. Why should one of my countrymen have a palace while another one lives in poverty? How can we as a nation tolerate the exploitation of our own working people? Is it not a sort of treason to sell your nation and your people to the business interests of another country? Would it not be the duty of a patriotic movement to direct the economy to benefit the people, workers, and employers alike? Congratulations! You've just discovered corporatism. The ideology that believes that the solution to class conflict is to be found in forcing the employers and the workers into a compromise for the benefit of the nation. This ideology influenced many political movements, but none more than fascism. Corporatism was one of the fundamental pillars of most fascist movements because it appealed directly to the common man with material benefits, protection from exploitation, and promised social harmony in the face of violent class tensions. In Italy, it was the main economic doctrine of the PNF, while in Spain it had great influence in Falangism and was an important element in the Francoist dictatorship. The influence was also felt in the Estado Novo in Portugal, and to a lesser extent in National Socialist Germany. Every one of these regimes had a national trade union that gave the party a mediating role in labor relations and offered direct benefits to its members. Generally, this meant housing and wage increases, but it depended on the regime. One interesting example is the German Kraft durch Freude, or KdF, which offered common people free state-sponsored vacations and other leisure activities. In fact, it was the world's biggest tourist operator in 1939. The left has generally called this type of socialist nationalism welfare chauvinism, which is the idea of having an extensive welfare state that is reserved for the members of a certain ethnic group, discriminating against non-members. However, socialism for the benefit of the nation still remains a very powerful political formula that unites national identity with economic benefit. The winning combination for the right wing is nationalism, socialism, and tradition. The success of fascism in the early 20th century is a testament to this, and today there are many nations that operate according to these principles of social welfare and ethno-nationalism, like Myanmar, Israel, and Russia. Although horseshoe theory is very often represented by people who, let's call them what they are, midwits, who think that they stand in the enlightened and rational center as opposed to the crazy extremes, it does observe the fact that the extremes of both left and right tend to have striking similarities, that they both embrace nationalism and socialism to consolidate their power and have a leader with a personality cult and a party that has absolute power over the state. I will argue that horseshoe theory is fundamentally correct even if their logic is wrong. The far left and the far right do not converge because they are ideologically similar, but instead because they both converge on the most powerful political formula, which could be summarized like so. The people want a state that takes care of all their needs, that represents their national and ethnic interests, that is led by a charismatic leader which assumes a paternal role to the people. Now, what to call this point of political convergence is a tricky subject. Stalinism was derisively called red fascism by leftist dissidents, and the Nazis were seen as having nationalism on the outside and socialism on the inside by the aristocratic conservatives of the Weimar Republic. Perhaps the most accurate and least politically loaded term would be revolutionary nationalism, but seeing as that would make for a bad title, I chose generic fascism, with a lowercase f, as a generic label to describe Juche, classical fascism, socialism with XYZ characteristics, National Socialism, Francoism, etc. You can call it whatever you want. You can even disagree with my decision to put all these different ideologies under the big tent of generic fascism for the sake of clickbait. But the point here is that all of these ideologies share a common political formula that results in a similar style of government. Each has a supreme leader, a single party, a secret police, state-sponsored social programs, and state-directed industry, a strong spirit of militarism, paranoia of outsiders, and expansionist attitudes with their neighbors. If you're not 100% convinced by my thesis that democracy leads to fascism, it's because you use your brain to realize that although this rule might apply to China and Angola, it does not seem to apply to the Western democracies, which have remained consistently liberal and consistently democratic for the past 80 years. Denmark is not heading into ultranationalism, and although some historical leftists think that Trump is doing a fascism, this is still very far from the case. So why then has Western democracy remained consistently liberal instead of spiraling down the electoral arms race which ends in revolutionary nationalism? When we observe the political movements of the early 20th century, we see that they had an order of magnitude more democratic energy than our own. Each party had a paramilitary wing, and their voters were fighting street battles. Revolutions and counter-revolutions were sweeping the world, and war was looming on the horizon. History was happening. But this opens the interesting question. Why was there so much more democratic energy 100 years ago? There were many relevant factors. Young people made up the bulk of the population, workers still lived in poverty, technology was rapidly transforming society. On one hand, revolution was attractive to the average worker who had little wealth and comfort to lose. On the other, the old political way of thinking crumbled when faced with modern technology and its social consequences, creating an ideological vacuum where new ideas like nationalism and socialism took hold. As Antonio Gramsci said, quote, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now it is the time of monsters." End quote. However, the last 70 years of politics have been generally calm in the First World, especially with the end of the Cold War. Political action was relegated to voting once every 4 years because it's your civic responsibility, and arguing with your family over Christmas dinner. The political parties held similar principles. Debate was concentrated around specific issues like monetary policy, foreign intervention, and Bill Clinton's sex life, and it seemed that history had finally reached its end. The simple fact is that there is very little democratic energy in the First World, especially when we compare it to the Third World. There are two main reasons for this. The first is that in the West today, there is peace and plenty. The average person has a house, a car, a pair of holidays. Why should such an individual really care about revolution? In the First World, the state's purpose is not to create a new type of society or to introduce radical reforms, but to keep the ship sailing smoothly, to preserve the status quo. These governments have developed a large bureaucracy that takes care of the affairs of the state. The bureaucracy then becomes the custodian of the status quo. It manages the economy and makes sure that everybody has enough and that nothing rocks the boat. The low democratic energy is not only the result of prosperity, but also because there is no ideological vacuum. There is almost a universal consensus that liberal democracy, with a free market, a welfare state, and individual liberty, is the only imaginable system. Since the Overton window is so small, elections don't really matter much because they only result in marginal changes to the status quo. To recapitulate, a society might have low or high democratic energy. If it is low, the population will not care much about politics, and the state will develop as a bureaucracy that focuses on preserving the status quo with only minor deviations depending on the party in power. If a system has high democratic energy, it will become bitterly polarized along political lines. There will be political violence, new ideologies are going to gain popularity, and eventually this will culminate in a leader which embraces a synthesis of the left and the right. However, today I believe that we're witnessing the First World transitioning between having low democratic energy in the 90s and the 2000s to once again entering an age of political polarization, probably the 2030s and 2040s. As I was writing this last paragraph, Charlie Kirk was shot by an quote-unquote anti-fascist. But this is just one further event in a long chain that has defined the last 10 years of political polarization. There are material reasons for this. The millennials represent the first generation where the average person is worse off than their parents. The job market is uncertain, real estate prices are reaching record highs, and the cost of living keeps going up. Real American GDP per capita has more than doubled from 2000 to 2024. But is the life of the average person really 2 times better? This essay is not here to offer economic explanations of this, but only to point out that economic disappointment is indisputably fueling political polarization. The left blames the rich and capitalism for this, the right globalism and offshoring, but the end result is the same, namely resentment and an increase in democratic energy. The other side of this is that today we are witnessing the formation of another ideological vacuum. In the 90s, with the end of the Cold War, it seemed clear that Western liberalism had the correct solutions to the important social and political questions of the time, and that everything would be fine for decades to come. No crises, economic declines, or ideological conflicts. This idea is best enshrined in the famous essay by Francis Fukuyama, which talks about the end of history. It argues that liberal democracy has shown itself to be the best system at creating peace, prosperity, and good government. Today, a good percentage of the population still agrees with this sentiment, that everything is fine and that we have it all figured out. However, there are fewer and fewer of them. My prediction for the foreseeable future is that the right-left divide will continue to grow to early 20th century levels of radicalization as the situation deteriorates in the Western democracies, especially for demographic reasons. None of the sides will be able to consolidate power despite political violence becoming an almost daily occurrence. This will culminate in a new synthesis under a Caesar-like figure. However, it is important to point out that neither Trump nor any leader around today is this Caesarist figure. Democratic energy is rising, but it is far from the levels needed to reach generic fascism. Furthermore, I'm not really in favor of this. I am no fan of current progressive bureaucracy. In fact, I despise it. But on the other hand, most times that a Caesar-like figure rises on a revolutionary nationalist platform, it ends terribly. Yes, there are some good examples like Lee Kuan Yew, but the people are much more likely to elect a person like Chavez, Hussein, or Perón. In the beginning of the essay, I commented that the word democracy has been abused to the point of meaninglessness. In our predominantly Western context, we categorize it with other sweet words like puppies and friendship. However, democracy is simply the political reflection of a people. This idealized version is correct if you're talking about Norway or Vermont. The issue is that these places are far away from hardship and conflict. History has long forgotten about them. Thus, their populations are soft and friendly. Of course, their humane and trusting policy reflects this. However, in the nations where the specter of history still hangs heavy, where democratic energy is high, to look at democracy is no easy task, because inside it, you will see the human condition. Man is an erratic thing, with contradictory desires. He is both kind and sadistic, envious and generous, open-minded and bigoted, empathic and cold-hearted. However, some of the public's desires are stronger than others. Tribalism is stronger than cinephilia. Avarice and envy are stronger than gratefulness. Temptation is stronger than temperance, and impulsiveness is stronger than patience. Through democracy, the state itself will reflect the character of its population, which is overwhelmingly tribal, impulsive, envious, and aggressive, which often converges in generic fascism, thus validating horseshoe theory for all the wrong reasons. The 20th century was the century of democracy, but because of this, it was also the century of mass mobilization, of political violence, revolution, and ethnic cleansing. Thus, democracy should not be a cutesy word that we use as political kitsch. It is the political reflection of man, and therefore it should command fear and awe. For man is not a teddy bear. Man is not only an animal. Worse, he is a political animal. And as history catches up with a still dreaming West, politics will once again reflect man's erratic nature, for better and most likely for worse.